All right, let's start going. Let's get going. Okay, so we've been going over monetary policy and fiscal policy. All right, one of the things, and we've been going over it piecemeal a little bit at a time. So one of the things I wanted to cover are the tools of the Fed. The Fed has officially three, it has more than that, but officially three major tools that it can use to change the money supply and change economic activity. The main goal of the Fed is to target the Fed funds rate. The main goal of the Fed would be to change interest rates, and I'll go over why that's so important. Okay. Why do I always have a hat on? Because trust me, when I haven't had a haircut in forever because of this nonsense, you don't want to see my hair right now. All right, so let's get going. I want to show you the three tools of the Fed. So the three tools of the Fed are discount rate. It can change the discount rate. It can change the reserve requirement, which I'll go over. And lastly, and most importantly, the most important tool of the Fed is something called open market operations. Open market operations means it can buy and sell bonds from the public or it can buy and sell bonds from banks. Okay, so we'll go into that in manipulating the money supply a little bit later. But so reserve requirement, discount rate, open market operations, aka buying and selling bonds. So a handy dandy memorizing mnemonic that we went over in class, but I wanted to review this, is there is expansionary. So we'll make a little chart here. And make a little chart and share the chart because otherwise you couldn't see it. All right, so the chart is this. Let me see if I can get going with this. Okay. So there are, I'm sorry, this is just not that neat. Expansionary, and contractionary. So there's expansionary and contractionary tools of the Fed. All right, contractionary would be you're targeting inflation. All right, so I'll put the target would be price level. Expansionary, the target is maybe GDP or unemployment. All right, so if you're trying to expand the economy, you're trying to, maybe you have high unemployment, you're trying to fix unemployment level, you're trying to help out GDP, which is one of the mandates of the Fed. The other mandate, remember the Fed has dual mandates, help grow the economy and help control inflation. So contractionary would be help control inflation, help control price level. Expansionary will be help GDP. So we'll do open market operations up here. Okay. Next would be discount rate. And discount rate is mainly symbolic. They can just set the discount rate if they want. They really have to target, with the money supply, they have to target the Fed funds rate. Discount rate and reserve requirement. Remember, the reserve requirement is the amount of every deposit that the banks are required to keep. And this is how the fractional reserve banking system works. It goes back to the goldsmiths back in medieval Europe. You can, let me do this. Back to the goldsmiths in medieval Europe, And you can look that in, if you have the McConnell Brew textbook, you can look up this story if they still have it in there. Um, the goldsmiths back in Europe, where did the fractional reserve banking system come from? It came from the fact that people would deposit gold with goldsmiths to hold them. And then they realized people would always deposit gold and they would never come back for it. They would just like save it for a rainy day. So the goldsmiths started to, they realized that they can lend out some of that money and still not have an issue because people kind of savers usually saved and borrowers usually borrowed. So uh, they would need an extraordinary thing where all their savers came back at the same time. Otherwise, they could very safely lend out a good chunk of the gold they had and get that loan back, and no one would be the wiser. And that's where the fractional reserve banking system came from. All right, so we'll go over that a little bit and how banks create money. But let me go back to here. Let me do this. So, all right, there we go. Look at so open market operations. If the Fed wants to expand the money supply, some teachers use buy bonds, bigger bucks. Think about if your parents were trying to help you, would you want more money or less money? And the answer is more money, right? So uh, if the Fed is trying to help the economy, same thing, it's giving more money. The way it gives banks money is by buying bonds. So a bank is sitting there with a bond, all right? Why would bank buy a bond? Because it buys it from the federal government. It's a safe place to stick your money and get a good return from it. So the bank is buying that asset to get that interest rate, to get that return. It doesn't care, the bank doesn't care where, and let me go back here. The bank doesn't care where it gets that interest rate from. All right, it could get it from any form of assets, but the federal government bonds are a safe place to get a safe return for your investors. So it has that interest rate on that bond coming in. It's making money. So the Fed comes in and it says, I'll give you this money instead. Here, I'll take the bond because you have to buy something. The bond is worth something. So they give the bank $10 million and they take the bonds off their hands. Okay. Well, the bank now, it used to make money, it used to make interest on those bonds, and now it's just sitting with cash. How does it make money with cash? And this goes back into how banks create money. They would lend that cash to borrowers. They'd lend it to people buying houses, starting businesses, whatever they're doing. Their bottom line is they take that cash, that new cash that they got from the Fed because the Fed bought that bond, and the bank lends that money out. So banks really don't care whether they're getting the money from the bond asset or whether they're getting that money from loaning me money to buy a house. I pay that bank 5%, the bond pays the bank 5%. They don't care. It's 5% is 5%. But the Fed cares because, when we go back to this, when the Fed buys over here bonds in open market operations, and this is would be buys bonds. When the Fed buys bonds, the bottom line is it's injecting money into the economy. It's increasing the money supply and lowering interest rates and allowing more people to take out those loans. All right, so we'll go into that. So, but bottom line is when the Fed buys bonds, it's releasing money into the banking system, which flows out to the people. All right. They're buying bonds to try to increase the money supply to try to lower the Fed funds rate. So what they're trying to do here is as well, they're just going to directly lower the discount rate. Lower the discount rate. The other thing they might do, they very rarely do that. The last time they did it, they went from like 12%, 12.5% to 10% back in the 80s. They can lower the reserve requirement. And we haven't gotten over the money multiplier, but the money multiplier is a lot like the Keynes GDP multiplier, where the less I require the bank to keep, the more it can lend out, the more it can increase the money supply, if that makes sense. So if I require the bank to keep half of every deposit and Mr. Krause deposits $1,000, the only thing that bank can do if there's a 50% reserve requirement is lend out 500 of that, right? Half of it can lend out half. If, on the other hand, the Fed only requires the bank to keep 10% because they lower it, All right, now out of that $1,000, they can only keep 10%. They only have to keep 100, and they can lend out 90%. So now they can loan out $900, thereby increasing the money supply. So these, all three here, this is the one I'll start, they use the most. Buy bonds, lower discount rate, lower reserve requirement. All right. Contractionary, if they're trying to control, stop people from spending money. People are spending too much money. They're overheating the economy. All right. Sell bonds. And you just reverse what I was saying. You sell bonds, you're taking liquidity from that bank. You're taking away the bank's ability to lend money. All right. And you're selling them a bond. So you're replacing what the bank has excess reserves. You're replacing those excess reserves with a bond instead. So it can no longer have excess reserves. It can no longer lend out that money. It can no longer increase the money supply. All right. So that's sell bonds. That's the one they use the most. Higher discount rate, raising the interest rate. The reason you're contracting the money supply is to try to raise the interest rate. I was going to buy that house. I can no longer buy the house. The loan was supposed to be 4%. Now it's 5.5%, and I don't qualify. I was going to buy the car at 0%. It's now 2% financing. I can't buy the car anymore. I was going to buy the fridge at 0%. It's now 1%. I can't buy the fridge. The bottom line is the higher the interest rate is, the less people can borrow money and buy, and the less C&I happens in the economy, and the GDP comes down. But most importantly, prices come down. So higher discount rate, higher interest rate, and higher reserve requirement. So those are the three options. Now, where is the memorizing mnemonic? And here, green is good. Bull, bull, shh, bull, shh. Remember, it's shh, not the curse, because that would be bad. Bull, shh. Right? Bull, the symbol of Wall Street is the bull. Bull is good. A bull market is a good market. Shh. If a teacher is telling you to shh, you've been bad, right? That's hurting the economy. So shh. So that's buy, lower, lower, sell, higher, higher. All right. So those are my tools. All right. We're going to go into in more detail why interest rate, in terms of the Fed, why interest rate is so important. And might as well, I think I have some time. Might as well do that now. Move this out of the way. All right. So the way, I'll just do expansionary and hopefully you can reverse it. The reason why interest rates are so important, and I think I went over this before, but this is a hard explanation and it's an important one. When the Fed lowers the Fed funds rate, remember, Fed funds, bank to bank, overnight loans, interest rate, all right, discount rate, Fed to bank loans. So if the Fed lowers, let me get a color that's more, can pop in the background. When the Fed lowers the interest rate, all right, if the Fed lowers the interest rate, interest sensitive expenditures, you have to use that term, interest sensitive. Interest sensitive expenditures, both C, people borrowing money to buy something, and I, businesses borrowing money to buy something. Interest sensitive expenditures is anything you need to borrow money to purchase. All right. You need to borrow money to purchase a house or a car or a big ticket item. You don't hopefully need to borrow money to buy a Twix or a candy bar. That's not an interest sensitive expenditure. So if interest rates go down, this is what the Fed does. Interest sensitive expenditures, C and I, increase. If C and I increase, those are both part of the aggregate demand formula. So aggregate demand will increase. If aggregate demand increases, it gives us a whole bunch. Now, this is the part on the explanation. A whole bunch of things. GDP will increase. GDP will increase. Price level will increase. So obviously we're not targeting inflation with this because this is going to cause a bit of inflation. Unemployment, most importantly, which is GDP and unemployment are probably what you're targeting. Unemployment will go down. All right. So that is the explain point. And obviously, if we're trying to hurt the economy, it just reverses it. All right. So the reverse would be the Fed raises interest rates. All right. Interest sensitive expenditures decrease. C spends less money. People spend less money. Businesses spend less money. This will decrease aggregate demand. And if it decreases aggregate demand, GDP will go down, price level will go down, unemployment will go up. But the goal of this, the reason we did this, would be to target this, because chances are they're doing this because of inflation. So that's it. All right, that's monetary policy, the tools of monetary policy, and the way the Fed controls the economy. I'm going to have more videos on how the Fed creates and manipulates the money supply, because that gets a little bit complicated. Krause University, look out for more videos.